Okay, a couple of admin notes. Your homework 2 has been graded. The class average is still greater than 100%. This is without the, so this is with extra credit, right? So you get extra credit for top performing entries, which most of them were top performing entries. So you got that. Nobody got extra credit for outperforming the TA, but that was another 10 points that you could have gotten, or actually couldn't have gotten. But that's where we are. Homework 3 is now finally out. Sorry for the delays in getting it out. You're implementing your own SVM, both in the primal QP and the dual QP. This is on a data set which was released by the LHC. It was on signal versus background classification. I don't even pretend to be a physicist to understand what these people are talking about. So this was the original Camel competition. What they did was there are a few different. They're searching for the existence of the Higgs boson particle, which apparently gives everything mass. Its presence needs to be detected from a few different measurements that were made by the instruments. It's actually a breakdown of a particle into something called a tau particle, which I don't understand. But as far as we are concerned, we've taken a subset of the data, which is 10,000 for training, 10,000 for testing. Each one of them comes with like 28 different features. The description of the features, I think, is available. Yeah. So the description of the features is available. I won't pretend to understand what a lepton is or what the transverse sphericity is, but if you're extremely interested, feel free to pick up an advanced particle physics journal and start reading away. I would recommend being a machine learning person and say that it doesn't matter. All that matters is the training and the validation. Okay. It's a binary classification problem, signal versus background. 21 plus 7, so these are sort of raw measurements, and these 7 high-level features are sort of hand-designed by physicists who looked at the measurements and said these quantities, so these 7 quantities should be useful for performing this task, right? So there's some domain expertise that has gone in to construct this data representation. And now this is where you come in and you will train a binary SVM, okay? Let's see, do I have the... yeah, so there are some theory questions about kernels and SVM. Most of the homework is about SVMs and about kernels. You have to implement an SVM in the primal form, so a QP solver. So we are actually providing you a particular QP solver because MATLAB QP solver is going to be slow for this task. So you're going to have to write this into the form that is accepted by a QP solver and actually solve the primal QP. You're also going to do it for the dual QP, and you will compare that the results are the same and what are the support vectors and things like that. I was actually so confident that this is such an easy task to do. You would think that writing your own SVM is difficult, but this is such an easy task to do. I can actually show you the solution. Seems like easy. Here's the solution. This is my train SVM function. You laugh, but so basically you have to write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 lines of code, right? And that's an SVM solver. That's all there is to it. Basically, the thing is that if you have already an access to a QP solver, it's just constructing the right matrices. That's essentially it. There's not much to do. What? How did I do that? So in computer vision, there's actually a problem called deconvolution. Exactly. So try it. If you decide that implementing an SVM is actually harder than solving the computer vision deconvolution, see if you can deconvolve this. That's not a bad thing. But this is writing 10 lines of code that much harder than you would actually try to solve deconvolution? That's when we would know whether your allegiances lie towards vision or learning. Anyway, so this can be done. This is actually pretty easy. Once you have access to once you treat a program as a black box solver, there's not much else that you need. Most QP solvers, most SVM solvers, packages that you may be using, don't actually do this. They're not treating they're not treating the SVM QP as an arbitrary quadratic program. Right, so this QP solver that we are actually providing, QuadProg is the MATLAB quadratic programming solver. QPAS is what we are providing to you. It's an efficient QP solver that I found that's publicly available online. It's actually built to handle arbitrary quadratic programs, but you're never going to solve arbitrary quadratic programs, right? So there's actually an algorithm called the SMO algorithm that solves this particular QP. So the dual QP of an SVM has a very particular form, and that particular form is that it's got a concave quadratic term subject to a single linear constraints, subject to sort of positivity and bounding box constraints, right? So you can actually write your own SVM dual QP solver, which is called, and that's the extra credit, it's called the sequential minimal optimization algorithm by John Flack. It's a paper that was released in the 90s. And it's actually not that hard to sort of code it up. It's something called a coordinate ascent algorithm, which means what it does is it solves this dual QP by picking pairs of variables at a time. So it picks alpha 1 and alpha 2, optimizes them to completion. You can actually show, and you will derive, if you decide to do the extra credit, that there's a closed form expression for doing that. That if you pick a pair of variables and hold everything else fixed, then the sub-quadratic program, right? So this is a quadratic program. If everything else is fixed, if I just consider two variables, then there's a closed form expression that you can derive for two variables. So what I can do is I can just write a for loop, pick pairs of variables, in closed form, make updates over them, and just repeat. And this is much faster, it exploits the structure of your problem. And this is, if you'd like, you can derive it. We don't ask you to implement it because it's actually, to implement the full thing, you have to be careful about which pairs of variables you choose. We don't want you to focus on that, so you can actually derive the coordinate ascent. Okay? I should mention that I actually have an interesting history with this algorithm. Back a long time ago when I was an undergrad, I spent a summer where my summer internship project was code up an SVM. Right? That's pretty much the instruction that I got at the start of the summer. So code up an SVM for some biometric problem. It doesn't really matter. I was handed a book on SVMs and I started reading, so exactly what you've been doing. You know, there's a geometric formulation, QP, blah, blah, blah. Everything I would read would sort of end, this is the QP, it can be solved. Right? As an undergrad, it's okay, it can be solved, but I don't really know how to code it up. So I went to Google and I Googled, SVM, QP solver, blah, blah, blah. And the paper that came up was SMO. Nobody told me that MATLAB had a built-in QP solver. I should have just called QuadProg. But what I found was this, so I ended up coding up in that entire summer the SMO algorithm, all because I didn't know that MATLAB had a QuadProg solver built in. So I could have just saved a couple of months. It was a 3-month internship, maybe the last 1.5 I was coding up SMO. So it's doable. If you'd like to do it, it's certainly fun. It tells you something about the problem. You gain some experience, but in this particular homework case, I would say just use a black box QP solver. As the first off, it's not hard. Okay. Any questions about the homework?
How long is it?
7 pages. Did you say how long is it? Yeah, but that's a bad way of measuring it. Let's see. So there are some theory questions about kernels, and then mostly it's the implementation and trying to wing. Again, it's on Kaggle. We encourage you to try different kernels. The TA entry is not that high. So the evaluation criteria this time is area under the ROC curve, and we've given you code to compute that. It's a standard MATLAB function. The area I think the TA entry is around 40. So there's sufficient improvement possible. Go crazy. I would still, just as usual, I would encourage start early. There's a lot to do. Any questions? Okay. So good luck. Good luck finding those challenges. All right. Midterm spotlight presentations. So that time is here. So we expect you to have made some progress. You told us that you were going to reach some point by the midterm, by the midway into the semester. We're slightly past the midway. We're just finishing out this March. Yeah, that's, I haven't quite specified which Friday. Yes, that's on purpose. So let me get to that in a second. So I'd like to do this on a Friday, if possible this Friday, but given the gasps that were it seems like next Friday might have to be it. This is the usual time of the computer vision and machine learning reading group that meets in Whitmore 654. I know there are no classes at that point of time, so this is, we are, one of the reasons I'm doing this outside of the regular classroom is because we've caught up into the schedule, so I don't want to get behind again by putting something in the regular class time. Okay? Does anybody here have a conflict with that time? Okay, excellent. You cannot have a class at this time. So the format we're going to follow is, this is a spotlight presentation. You promised us something. Think about, 4-minute. This is not too much work, but we need you to spend time and be clear about what you're doing. So your first slide or second slide, tell us exactly what problem you're solving, what is the data, what are the variables, what is the input, what is the output, right? Is it a classification problem, binary classification, multi-class classification, regression? What problem are you working on? What is the data? And what are the sort of tools that you're working with, okay? And then tell us, here's what I was supposed to do by midterm, here's what I've done, right? If you're stuck somewhere, if you have some preliminary results, great, tell us. If you're stuck somewhere, tell us where you're stuck and what's the problem. Maybe people can give you ideas about this. I would like everyone to be there, even if so we may have to do this over 2 days, but even if you're not presenting that day, what we'll do is we'll do a sorted ordering of people. We should be able to get most of the things done, but I'd like everyone to be there because you want to see what others are not doing. At the end of the semester, if we do have a poster presentation, you probably won't have time to go around and look at other people's posters. So it's always good to know what are others in the class doing. Okay. So coming to the important part, who thinks they can go this Friday? Nobody wants to go this Friday. Okay, we'll do next Friday. Right? Please mark this on your calendars. I'll make an entry on Scholar, so you put up your slides there before Friday, so that we can grade. We can provide you points for those things based on your presentation. Does that make sense? Yes.
Are we going to get feedback on our project proposals before that?
Yeah, I'm working on it. I'll that back. Okay. Any other questions about this? Yes?
Did you say that there's going to be an assignment for your poster slides on Scholar?
So I'll create like an assignment on Scholar where the day before you can post your slides, and that way we'll have some logistical place where we can give you points for that presentation. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
And I guess like our progress is just based on like what we said in our proposal, like where we'd be at this time?
Yeah. So
Okay.
tell us how much progress you've made. At this point of time, it's at least expected that you have access to the data that you said you would. You've tried a few things, done pre-processing, fed it into a solver that maybe you have already implemented, like a nearest neighbor or something. And a lot of people said, I will use a solver X, and that's something that you by now already use. So maybe you try that. Any other questions? Okay. All right, so let's get started. So here's where we were last time. We were talking about linear SVMs. We had done this. We've done this geometric argument about linear SVMs being max margin solvers. There are multiple linear separators that can get you 100% perfect classification on a data set. On a data set that is linearly separable. And the one that you should choose is the one with the maximum margin. We wrote that down as a quadratic program, and we sort of derived the Lagrangian dual of that program, wrote down a Lagrangian, and we said, okay, here's the dual, which is also a concave sort of objective function. Now there are these dual multipliers, and you can solve this problem. This was for the linearly separable case, the hard margin case, where there were no slacks. If you start adding slacks, this is what the primal looks like, and the dual actually looks just slightly different. You just get an upper bound on each of the dual variables. Okay. And we talked about how there are some quadratic programming algorithms that can solve this dual faster than the primal. We talked about the kernel trick, and the kernel trick. The key thing was that we observed that in the dual, the data xi xj only appears in dot products. So if we have access to some other function that computes dot products in some feature augmented space, so phi is a feature map or kernel map that takes your data, takes it to a high dimensional space, and inner products in those high dimensional space, if you can efficiently compute through some function, your QP does not blow up. It no longer has a dependence on the dimensionality of this high order space. Right? That's a really nice thing to do because you can plug in different kinds of kernels and they correspond to different feature augmentations of your data. Okay, so this is where we were last time. Today what we're going to try to do is finish SVMs by looking at multi-class SVMs. Everything that we looked at so far was binary SVMs. And we're going to look at neural nets. Okay. All right, so let's talk multiple classes. So far we've talked about a two-class problem. What if we have a third class? What are the common ways of, if all we've introduced here is a binary classifier, how would you use it for a multi-classifier?
One versus all.
One versus all. So that's one common way of doing it. It's called one versus all or one versus rest. And what you do in these sort of things is you train a binary classifier, one for each class, where the positive is that class and the negative is all other classes. So you train a plus classifier with minuses and circles as the negative class. You train a minus classifier with these two as the negative class. And you train a circle classifier with these two as the negative class. Right? That's one way of doing it. You end up learning n classifiers independently. This can be done in parallel. You end up with n classes. The second way of doing it is called one against one, or in this case you have to learn n choose 2 classifiers. So for every pair of classes, so there's a y1, y2 classifier, there's a y1, y3 classifier, there's a y2, y3 classifier. So this is 3 choose 2, you learn 3 classifiers here. Right. And there are sort of advantages and disadvantages in terms of computation of doing these things. If you're learning a one versus all, if a new category is introduced, then you have to go ahead and retrain all previous classifiers, because the rest changed in every single one. In this one, you don't have to retrain everything else, right? You just have to train n new classifiers. In both of those cases, you run into some problems. And those problems arise because you run into these problems of regions in the feature space that no one wants to claim, and regions in the feature space that multiple classifiers want to claim. Right? So you can have this classifier that says C1 not C1, C2 not C2, two different classes. Now this region is not C1, it is not C2, so you actually don't have a label for this region. And you can have regions where this is on the C2 side of things, this is on the C3 side of things, and this is on the C1 side of things. So there's this little region in your feature space which is claimed by 3 different classifiers. It's considered positive for 3 different classifiers, yes?
I thought you said that R3 would be the one nobody claims. Wouldn't that be the green answer?
R3 would be the one nobody claims. The green would be claimed by both C1 and C2. So this is the C1 side, this is the not C1 side.
Oh, okay.
This is the C2 side, this is the not C2 side. So this is not C1, not C2, you don't know how to do this. So this problem we'll come back to, but this problem, it feels like you should be able to fix this. How would you fix it? Max score of SVM, and that's where you run into that problem that scores of binary SVMs are not calibrated. Right? When this classifier gives it a score of plus 10, and this classifier gives it a score of plus 20, you do not automatically have calibration between those numbers, and you cannot take a max of the scores. So, does that make sense? Okay. So the way to fix these problems is to simultaneously learn all the weights. So one weight for every category, right? So think about in this case, you have one weight for every category. C1 not C1, C2 not C2, and whatever, C3 not C3. And what we'd like to do is learn them simultaneously so that the scores that they're assigned to anything are calibrated. So let's do that. So the notation that we're going to use is there's a weight 1 vector for the first class. So there are k classes, right? 1 all the way to capital K. And what we're going to do is each one will learn a weight vector and a bias. Right? So B1, W1, all the way till WK, BK. There's one for every class. Before we just had 2 classes and we could get by with 1 set of weights. Now we have k classes and we'll get by with k sets of weights. Right? And what we'll do is we'll say that each one assigns a score or S of class C is going to be WC transpose X plus C. Right? So this is the score assigned to data point X. This is the score assigned to data point X by the Cth classifier. Right? And what we'll say is that you're provided a data set. This is your training data set, right? X1, Y1, all the way to Xn, Yn. What you'll do is you'll try to enforce this constraint that score of correct class minus score of incorrect class is greater than or equal to 1. So if you, this is an equation that I'll write down in a second, but remember for a binary classifier case, what we did was we wrote down a hyperplane, we said positives should lie here, negatives should lie here, and now what's happening is that there isn't one such negative, there are actually multiple classes, right? There's an X class and so on. And what you're saying is, I'm telling you what the correct class is, and that score is WYI transpose XI plus BYI. That minus the incorrect class W of, let's say, Y transpose X plus BYI has to be greater than or equal to 1 in all Y not equal to YI. Does that make sense? So you force the correct class to give a score to this data point. So yi is the correct class, right? I'm telling you this instance is class number 10. Right? And so that score should be greater than the score assigned by all incorrect classes, all other 9 classes, if you will, by a margin of 1. If you think about it, what we were doing before was positive class greater than +1, negative class less than -1, so we were enforcing essentially a margin of 2 over norm. Here we're just enforcing a margin of at least 1 over norm from the highest scoring every other class. Right? Does that make sense? This is the correct class. Over all other classes, there should at least be a margin of 1. All other incorrect classes. Does that make sense? I'm sorry?
Why not 2? Why did we change the margin from 2 to 1?
The choice of 1 or 2 is completely arbitrary, right? You could have written the parallel lines as W transpose X plus B is equal to plus half, right? So that scalar is completely arbitrary. And I could have done the same thing. I can write this as 2 as well. We want to change the absolute scalar. Okay. So notice that now I can still write minimize, so I can do the same thing. For example, if this cannot be exactly satisfied, I can still add a slack term here, right? So the incorrect class can maybe score higher than the correct class, right? Or maybe it violates the margin by Z. And I can set up the same sort of optimization problem where I penalize for violations and I minimize the WC transpose WC half, except now this is a summation over all C from 1 to K. So minimize the norm of class 1, minimize the norm of class 2, minimize the norm of class k, such that they all, like for every single data point, the correct class scores higher than the incorrect class. And this is still solvable because this is still a quadratic program. Right? You have now, your optimization variables are W1 all the way till WK, and V1 all the way till VK, and ZIs. Right? So you have more optimization variables. You still have linear constraints because this is linear in W and V. Right? Those are all the variables. And so you have the number of constraints here are number of classes k minus 1 times the number of data points plus number of data points because you also have a ZI here. Does that make sense? So in the previous case, they were, there was one constraint for every data point. Now there are k minus 1 constraints, one for every other incorrect class. And this is a natural blow up, right? It was positive versus negative, now it's positive versus everything else. And the fact that they're always, at training time, you're always comparing the scores of these classifiers at training time means that these norms that you end up learning and the weights and the scores that you end up learning are naturally comparable. They're still not calibrated in a global sense. These 10 categories versus these 10 categories, the scores you still won't be able to compare. But if you train these 10 categories together, these scores are comparable. Right? Because at training time, you have enforced that the correct one should score higher than the incorrect one. That makes sense? And this, just for sake of completeness, this is called the Creamer simulation. This came out in the 1990s. And this has been generalized to in a bunch of other ways. Yes?
Can you explain the second line, k minus 1 times n?
Right, so I was counting how many such constraints are there. So I wrote down for all y not equal to yi, and there's also a for all I. Right? How many constraints are there? You have to force, for every data point I, you have to force the correct class to be greater than, the score of the correct class to be greater than the score of the incorrect class. How many incorrect classes are there? K minus 1. There are k minus 1 incorrect classes and there are n data points. So that many constraints plus n because of this. That makes sense? Okay. So this is what is known as, you'll often hear this said as natively multi-class or a multi-class SVM, which just forces the, yes?
Can you go back one second?
Yes.
So the first problem that you are describing, with this problem occur if you are doing like classification for, and choose to classification for every pair of classes.
The
So
first
like
problem.
that region R3 should belong, like should be considered as positive for at least one category?
Yes. If you do n choose 2,
Yeah.
then there is no not category, right? Every classifier is C1 versus C2.
Right.
So every data point in this feature space gets at least one label.
Right.
The problem is it's getting multiple labels
Yeah.
potentially from multiple classifiers. Yeah. So this not problem only happens in the one versus rest. Okay. And in some sense, you can think of the not problem as trying to solve. I look at the score and I take the max score or the min score to decide.
Right.
The min score is you'll have to decide based on that. But again, really the better way of solving it is simultaneously learning these things. So learn 3 sets of weights simultaneously. Does that make sense? Okay. So just these set of constraints. Correct class minus incorrect class is greater than 1, which is the same thing as saying correct class scores higher than incorrect class by a margin of 1. So that's why there's a plus 1. And this is the same reason why we're forcing this to be plus 1. If I set this to 0, then the 0 weights will start satisfying this, right? 0 is greater than equal to 0 and that will work. So that's why I need some epsilon, which is strictly positive, and that epsilon can be scaled. Okay. And that's what this SVM looks like. It's essentially just a simple generalization. Okay. Let's see. Did I hold that? Okay. So at this point, we're essentially done with SVMs. We've seen a bunch of things, and we'd like you to sort of remember and have an idea of all the various components that we've taught you. So duality in SVMs, kernels, why kernels are useful, multi-class SVMs, and the geometric intuition of it. Okay. All right. So here's where we're going. So we made this argument that if there are data sets that are not separable, you try to separate them in a higher dimensional space. Right? You augment your data with new dimensions, and you try to make it separable. That's one way of handling it. And let me try to just write this on the board. So in this class, if you think about it, you've seen three kinds of classifiers or regressors, if you will. You've seen the linear classifiers. So for example, naive Bayes, logistic regression. They are linear both in W and in D, and in input X. Right? So logistic regression was probability of Y equals 1 given X, comma W was 1 over 1 plus e to the negative W transpose X, right? And we said this learns a linear decision boundary, right? So this is a natively linear classifier. It's linear both in W and X, right? Because this learns a decision boundary which says W transpose X is greater than or equal to 0, right? And then we saw sort of kernel classifiers, which were still linear in W, but they were non-linear in X, right? Because you introduced a feature map, phi of X, and we started doing this, W transpose phi of X. And so this feature map was essentially creating new dimensions, and those new dimensions could be, for example, x1 squared, and so on, x1 cube, and n. Right? So this could be cubic in X, but it's actually still linear in your parameters. Does that make sense? So this is a transition we made when we introduced kernel SVMs and things. And we said you can apply the same ideas to kernel logistic regression, for example, by using a feature map here. Where we're going next are sort of natively non-linear classifiers, if you will. Natively non-linear. So these are going to be classifiers that are non-linear in both W and X. Right? So the examples of these are going to be neural networks, neural nets, and decision trees. And this is that's the progression of the class, right? That's where we're going. So a lot of the tools that we initially learned, we wanted the math to be simple. Everything is nice and convex and linear here. Things are still convex, but linear in W, that's why they were nicely convex. Here we'll run into problems that non-linearity in W will lead to non-convexity of whatever objective functions we want to implement. Right? So this is going to be both neural networks and training decision trees are going to be problematic. We will not have, by problematic I mean we will not have polynomial time algorithms that can exactly minimize the objective function that we want to minimize. Right? Here we could, there was no stochasticity in an SVM solver. Right? Every time you give it the stochasticity came in because of the data set. Once you give me a data set, I could solve it to optimality, and I could always give you the SVM under your objective function. Once we move to non-linear problems, we will have, for example, that we'll have to use approximation algorithms. We'll have to give you back algorithms that are not guaranteed to give you the global optimum for whatever objective function you're interested in. Okay? Okay, so that's sort of where we're headed. So for linearly non-separable data sets, one option is to add non-linear features, right? And that's essentially making your classifier still linear in parameters but non-linear in W, and we're going for the second option, which is non-linear in parameters. Okay. These are going to be, of course, more general. They're going to be harder to learn. So now we're finally going to run into the optimization error that we had talked about in the beginning of the class. So far, there was no optimization. In a lot of places, they will end up outperforming linear classifiers. And this is the reason why we've set this up as a progression, is because this is in some sense the progression that you should try as a practitioner. When you get a new data set, the first thing you should try is not some crazy 10-layer neural network or a decision tree model, right? You should start simple, try a linear classifier, because you know at least you would have abstracted away optimization problems. You don't have to worry about, am I even solving this thing to completion? Right? You don't have to worry about those sort of things. Start simple with a linear classifier and then progress onwards. First check, are you overfitting or underfitting with a linear classifier? And in some sense, these ideas are going to be related. The fact that linear in what and non-linear in W, we're going to come back and make this connection precise, that just like kernels corresponded to some particular feature map. So for example, polynomial kernels correspond to feature map with monomials of your data. Neural networks and even decision trees are going to correspond to some sort of a feature map that you are then doing linear classification in. It's just that that feature map is not specified by the algorithm designer. So for example, when you choose a kernel, when you choose polynomial kernel of degree 3, you are choosing a particular linear map. Right? You are choosing what features to use. In some domains, you're not going to have any ideas, why should I use a polynomial kernel or an RBF kernel? So what you'd like your machine learning algorithm to do is to essentially learn to extract features. And that's why increasingly in modern times we're seeing a lot of success of neural networks or what has now come back as deep learning. The idea is that there are data sets where I don't want to hand encode. So far, everything that we've shown you is you use your domain expertise to decide some features, and then we're going to do machine learning on top. What is different about neural networks or nonlinear classifiers, their way of viewing them, is that we'd like to feed in raw data and we'd like the algorithm to figure out what sort of phi of x is useful for this problem that I'm interested in. Does that make sense? And that's why it's going to be it's going to be very difficult to do, it's going to lead to non-convex problems. Okay, let's take a minute here and then we'll start with
like $10 for like unlimited wine and beer. Okay, yeah. Like I'm going to that. A bunch of those on the left. Gonna have so many places out there. I was just like, this Friday. Yeah. So that's why I was freaking out at first. I was like, but next weekend.
It's like right before that. But they also scheduled some more workshops. And the more professors and they were all like, sorry, we want to give you a seminar. I was so
wall vault. Well, I don't know whether it was just like our elementary school or what, but the way this building was set up was like, it like towards the back, it was like 3 stories tall, and so it was just like this huge, but there were no windows for some reason. So we just had like a giant ass wall that we could just throw the ball. That's perfect. It was so small. Yeah, and like, you know, we had like all these games, all the rules.
我跟他说了，让他给你个自己的奖品。
I don't know why they decided. I honestly think they had like design like my okay, thank you. Or someone else, but not not any.
Do me a favor, just send me an email.
Ignore me for like oh, that is.
Okay. Let's continue. So, as I mentioned, we're moving towards a topic. We're starting a topic called neural networks, and they've seen a strong resurgence in recent times. Neural networks are actually a pretty old research idea and topic. Back in the 50s is when the first sort of artificial neuron or neural network was first conceived or designed. This predated modern PCs or machines. This idea existed when they couldn't actually code it up on any software, right? It has sort of biological underpinnings, but it's important to sort of be intellectually honest and say that's not the goal here. Right? There are some ideas that we derive from looking at human brains and human neurons. And there is a certain subset of people, for example, neuroscientists, who are interested in biologically plausible models to model the human brain. Let's be clear that that's not the goal here. The goal was to come up with something that mimics a certain kind of intelligence structure that the human brain does, and then let's just do well at a classification, whatever task that we're interested in. Okay. So there's a bunch of names you'll hear. You'll hear sort of artificial neural networks. You'll hear sort of feed-forward neural networks, multi-layer perceptrons. Those are all the same names for this idea of neural networks or feed-forward neural networks. There are various types that we'll look at, like something called a convolutional neural network or something called an autoencoder or recurrent neural networks. Anytime you hear that term, just map it to sort of neural networks is what we're talking about. And in sort of modern popular science literature, you'll often hear the term deep learning or deep nets, and it's essentially the same. There is no difference. It's just PR rebranding because they don't want to use the name that ran out of funding the last time this agenda crashed, which is not to sort of I guess that's important. It's a real life concern, right? So there has been. So the first, as I mentioned, the first time this idea arose was in the 50s and 60s. Back in the 80s, if I'm not wrong, neural networks saw a second sort of a resurgence, if you will. 90s is when, if you went to a machine learning conference, 90s and 2000s was when neural networks were essentially dead. It was extremely difficult to publish a paper on neural networks, and you had to sort of form your own conferences. And modern machine learning conferences were all about SVMs, kernels, and sort of kernel machines and other sorts of things, and graphical models also, which you haven't seen in this class. But today, if you go to either a vision conference or a speech conference or a machine learning conference, all you hear are applications of deep learning, which is essentially neural networks. The reason for, let's give them some credit. Why is it called deep learning? It's called deep learning because the idea is that so far what you've seen in this class is somehow there's a data, there's some representation X or phi of X, and there's some simple classifier like a linear classifier. There's an argument that that feels incorrect, that feels too shallow, that somehow we as humans don't have a single layer of representation. People store memories or other such things in their brain which we don't actually know exactly how it's done. We have some ideas, but there are multiple layers of representations that you'd like to hold. So to start from raw bits to some high-level entity extraction that you'd like to do, you can't do it in a single step, and therefore you'd like to have multiple layers of representations. That's where the term deep learning or deep nets comes from. Okay. So let's start simple. Let's start at a biological neuron, right? And I am not a biologist. I do not understand much of this, but the intuition was that if you sort of look at a single neuron in the brain, it turns out that it sort of looks like, at an abstract level, a computational unit. There's these structures called dendrites, which neurons tend to have electrical and chemical activations and impulses based on input that they receive from other neurons, and they actually have an output which goes through an axon, which can have sort of branchings and connect to other neurons. Right? So this was sort of the observation, and the idea was, can we model this as a computational unit? Can we write down an artificial neuron? So let's write down an artificial neuron that sort of that contains this idea. So here's the artificial neuron. It's a cell. It receives input from a bunch of other neurons, and I will start using notation that will make it immediately clear what I'm trying to make this connection to. But let's say the input that it's getting from other neurons are sort of like x0 all the way till xd. Right? So there are actually strengths of these connections. So this will be w0, w1, different connections from different cells have different strengths. Some of them are, large because you trust those other neurons. Some of them are small because you don't, or so on. There is something called an activation, which is when a neuron fires based on what input it receives. And there's finally sort of like an output that a neuron makes. And the way this happens is your activation is essentially a linear combination, a weighted wi of xi, I going from 0 to d. Right? So your activation, what this cell sort of receives as sensory input is how strong was the input coming in from some other cell times how much do I trust it or not, right? And then the activation is actually passed through some sort of a non-linear function. So there's some function g which is called an activation function or a response function. Right? So this is an activation. And this is a response function. And that's finally your output that you actually pass on to other units. So that's it. That's all of what, this is where the biological plausibility essentially ends, right? Because you have to, okay, this I understand, this is just a weighted linear combination. What sort of response functions are allowed? And as soon as you start defining a few different types of response functions, you actually realize that, yeah, I know that. We've studied that, right? So what if I do g of a equals a, so just a linear response function. A cell receives an activation, whatever activation it gets, it passes that forward. That is just y hat equals summation of wi and xi. We know what that is, that's just linear regression. Mm-hmm. Yes?
Don't we need a bias?
So you just that common trick. Right? There you have a bias. Okay, so this is just 0 to d, and this is just linear regression, right? We know what this is. What if the activation function g of a was a sigmoid? So it's something that looks like this. So it's an activation function that, until the activation becomes positive, doesn't quite fire. So it stays, the activation stays low. After 0, it actually fires, right? With some smoothly equipped. That's a logistic regression, right? Because this thing is just 1 over 1 plus e to the negative of w transpose x, and that's probability of y equals 1 given x over w. We know this as well. You can have another activation function which is just a step function, right? So I can write g of a is sort of this sort of a step function. So it's 1 if the activation is greater than 0 and 0 is. What is that? It's just a binary classifier, right? It's a binary classifier that says if W transpose X is greater than or equal to 0, then I say +1. If W transpose X is less than 0, I say 0. It's just a step function applied to a linear accumulator. We've been doing this entire time, right? With SVMs, for example. This was what the objective function was different, but this is essentially what an SVM was doing, right? And there was a bias here, so W transpose X plus B is greater than 0. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. So great. It feels like this sort of computational unit with different response functions essentially models a linear regression, it models logistic regression, it models binary classification, but it doesn't really add anything to what we've been doing. Right? We know how to handle all of these things, and we know that both logistic and the SVM are actually just learning linear classifiers. Right? Even the logistic corresponds to exactly this decision boundary. It's just learned with a different objective function. So this doesn't so far help us learn non-linear decision boundaries. So how do we learn non-linear decision boundaries? Exactly. Multiple. So a single neuron is still a linear decision boundary. You just stack a bunch of them together, right? You form a network, and that's what is called a neural network. By the way, so I'll draw it on the board, but I'd like to say that I wrote down a linear response function, a sigmoid or logistic response function, but you can have many other sort of arbitrary non-linear response functions. Right? So let's look at something called a one hidden layer or a 3-layer neural network. Right? These things, let's draw them out. So far it was a single neuron. We'll just expand that into multiple layers. There's something that we can do. So there'll be A1 here, A2 here, all the way till AM. And each one of these weights go to every single of these AMs. And let's see, so this is what is called an input layer. This is called a hidden layer, and I'll talk about why this is called a hidden layer. And ultimately you have a single output layer, so A out, if you will, and these things to output as well. And finally, y hat is equal to g of A out. Does that make sense? So this is called a 3-layer neural network. There's the output layer, there's a single hidden layer, and there's an input layer. The reason why this is called a hidden layer is because you know what the input is provided to you, you know what the output should be, but it's not exactly clear what is the right answer at the hidden layer. Right? In fact, what you can think of these as your features, and this as some higher dimension or lower dimension embedding of your features. Right? What this is basically doing is it's creating new features from the input on which you're going to perform linear classification. Does that make sense? Except the process of creating new features will also be controlled by these weights. Does that make sense? So here's what that would look like. So this is AJ, right? So if I take a single neuron from here and I draw it out here, so it's going to look at WJ0. I should mention that there's a common trick that's done that in any hidden response, there's usually a bias feature that is added in any hidden layer. Right? So instead of forcing one of the neurons to learn a constant, you actually just add a constant in every hidden layer. So this is, for example, WJ0, WJ1, all the way till WJB. Right? These are all the features. So any activation is still WJ transpose X, which is the same thing as WJI times XI, I equals 0 to D. any activation is then converted into something called a hidden response. So Hj is G of Aj. And so for example, this would be H1, this would be H2, all the way till Hn. There's m of these hidden things. And those are all combined into, so for example, A out is equal to summation of W out of I, Hi, I going from 0 to n. Does that make sense? So input multiplied by a whole bunch of weights to get an activation, multiplied by another bunch of weights to get another activation, input multiplied by another bunch of weights to get this activation. All of these activations pass through a bunch of non-linearities to get these hidden responses. All of those pass through, multiplied with a bunch of weights, to get this output activation, which is then passed through a non-linearity to get the final response. Does this make sense? Yes?
Wouldn't A out depend on the x's as well, or like one up, the next equation up?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that depend on the x's as well?
No, so actually, in typical neural network connectivity, you don't have input directly connected to the output. So the input is only connected to the next layer, and the next layer is only connected to the output layer. It is not the case that the output is directly connected to the input. Does that make sense? You can obviously, this type of an architecture, you can define other sorts of connections, but this is sort of the simplest way of writing this out. So this is basically like, so how many parameters in this algorithm are there? There are, W1 weight vector here, there's a W2, so yeah, W2 weight vector here, all the way till Wm weight vector here, right? Each one of these weight vectors multiplies the incoming features. Each one of them is some d+1 dimension, right? So the total number of parameters in this system are W1 all the way to Wm. Each one of them, Wi, is in R of d+1. And there's one output parameter here. Right? So W out belongs to R of M. Does that make sense? So think of these as knobs. Initially, we were just controlling these knobs. This output was connected to the input. There was no hidden layer representation. You just had this weight to set. And so what is the best linear combination of my data that produces a hyperplane? Now it's sort of like, first you take your features, multiply them by a bunch of these weights to get other features, and then you learn a classifier on these features. Does that make sense? Okay.
What's the response function? That is also hand designed?
So the response function usually, so what is hand designed here and what is learned? Usually the architecture is hand designed. You just sort of construct some architecture. You have to choose what M is, so how many layers. So instead of one hidden layer, you can have multiple hidden layers. What is the response function G that you use? Typically, every single neuron uses the same G value. Although, you can imagine when we write down the learning algorithms, nothing will prevent us from saying this is a GO and this is a GI. So using different non-linearities are different things, but usually that is not done.
So you mean same response for all the neurons in one layer and also for all the layers?
Exactly. Same response functions. Yes. So typically those are hand designed. Everything that is learned is like, so these are the usually parameters that are learned from data. That makes sense? Just a second. Was there a question?
Just the way the arrows are for W1. So what is the weight? I thought the weight was more related with each one.
Let me make sure I draw these arrows correctly, just so you understand this. So this is x0. It's connected to this. So all of the x's are connected to all of the a's, right? And so there are d+1 incoming connections here, and therefore there are d+1 weights here. W1 0 all the way to W1 d, right? So this together is a vector. It's a d+1 dimension, right? And there is one such. So this is a W1 vector, and there's one such vector at every neuron. Yes.
So even if we have like multiple hidden layers, then our input is always going to be X. So whatever we have in those hidden layers are all produced from X. So
Exactly.
Isn't what we achieve by this could be achieved by having, let's say, some complex function for Z? Isn't it equivalent?
Yeah. So obviously this is functions of functions of functions of ultimately an output, right? So we can't create something that wasn't present in the input, but this is a highly non-linear function, right? Initially we were just restricted to linear functions of the input. Now we are allowing ourselves.
So we are building a non-linear function by combining a bunch of linear functions.
It's not just linear functions, right? Because G is non-linear, right? But it's combining non-linear. So first doing linear combinations and then passing them through a non-linearity. Does that make sense? Okay. One thing that should be clear is, you can make this multiple hidden layers. So I can, in some sense, often write this figure entirely as I can write this figure as just like a box, right? There is some neural network here. The input to that is, all the way from x0 to xd, right? There may be multiple layers, and whatever the last layer here is, I just have to connect that to my output, right? And one way of viewing this is that this neural network is a feature extractor. It goes ahead and extracts some, some features that I perform my linear classification on. Does that make sense? Except the key thing here is this feature extractor is learned. It has some parameters, and I will learn those parameters to do well on whatever loss function I care about. Okay. So if you want to use neural networks to do regression, you are going to choose G out as just A out, right? So G is just a linear thing. So this way, your output y hat can go from minus infinity to plus infinity. Right? If you want to do classification, binary classification, your G out will be the sigmoid function, 1 over 1 plus e to the negative of it. If you want to do multi-class classification, you'll have a network, and if you have k classes, so if you want to do k-way classification, you will have not just a single output neuron, but you will have k output neurons. So y1 all the way till yk. And each one of the second last layer of the neural network will be connected to all of these things. And so y1 will be 1 over 1 plus e to the negative of k1, if you will. Does that make sense? Right? At training time, what you will do is you will use something called 1 of k encoding. A 1 of k encoding is, let's say you have k classes, you will actually convert your, if let's say yi for the ith sample, let's say if y is 4, right? If you have 10 classes and the data point that we're talking about has ground truth as 4, you will convert this into a 10-dimensional binary vector. Right? You will say this is the new ground truth. It has 1 at the 4th dimension and 1, 2, 4, 5, right? And sort of zeros everywhere else. So that's the new ground truth for this sort of neural network. You want it to fire at the 4th place, but not fire any of the other places. Does that make sense? Okay. So neural networks, I will show a couple of videos, but I want to mention neural networks have this interesting this result was sort of intuitively known from a long time, but formally proven in the 1980s. This is the idea of neural networks with just a single hidden layer representation, also called universal function approximators. What that means is that a 3-layer neural network with linear outputs, in the hidden layer will be non-linear activations, but the output response function is linear, can uniformly approximate any continuous function to arbitrary accuracy given enough hidden units, right? So we're not telling you what enough means, how many hidden responses do you need, but this is a really strong theorem, right? It means whatever output function you're trying to learn can be learned with a sufficiently powerful neural network. And that result should scare you again, right? That's not a good thing. If you can learn anything, it means you're going to overfit. Right? It means you're going to have to see a lot of data before you can distinguish this from the function that you are actually trying to do. Let's see, so I have a demo here that I can show. Just crash. Okay, excellent. So let's say this is the function that we're trying to learn, right? This is a quadratic. We don't know it's a quadratic. All we see are these samples, these red points. Right? And the architecture is a 3-layer neural network: input, hidden layer, output. If the hidden layer did not exist, then it's just linear regression. So the best we can do is just a linear function. Right? So I can try to mimic that by actually forcing it to use a linear, So it actually won't let me put 0 hidden number of hidden units, but I'll explain this later. But one way I can nullify the hidden layer representation for regression is actually by choosing linear response functions. It turns out that if you don't use any non-linearity, so you can take input linear combinations to form new features. If you don't pass it through any non-linearity, linear combinations of linear combinations are just linear combinations of input. Right? So essentially the network collapses into a 2-layer neural network. So that's what I'll do. And let me try to see training. Yeah, so let's try to ask it to train. Right, so this is, it's trained in an iterative algorithm. On the x-axis here are iterations of learning. What we're doing is we're tweaking those parameters, right? W's, this is the best fit, linear fit that we can learn. Right? The red here is, blue is validation error and red is training error. So we have some amount of error that we're making on our training data and validation data. Right? The best we can do is a linear function because there's no non-linearity in the network. Now let me try to change the neural network and I'll say, okay, you can use, let's see, you can use, I'll explain what bipolar sigmoid is later. Let's see, let's resample some weights. And let's say train. So it actually does slightly better, right? It actually tries to at least get this part of the curve. We can do a little bit better. Let's add a few more hidden neurons and let's go ahead and train. You actually get this much better fit. So these are iterations of training. The errors were mostly constant for a while. At some point, this is what are we minimizing? We're minimizing some loss function, which is again squared fit. And at some point, they make heavy improvement on that error, and it fits in very nicely, right? So you get this sort of shape. The thing that you should be concerned, yes?
Is the validation in the less than training error?
I'm not entirely sure. So I think in the end, it doesn't really.
Yeah, but like initially, if you were to.
I think that may have to do with, if I remember correctly, it has to do with the fact that, yeah. So the training set has some sample noise, but the validation set does not have any sample noise. And actually, let's exploit that. This is something that I plan to show anyway. Let's add a little more noise. So here, look at the samples from the training data. Right? So there's far more noise. They're still coming from that same underlying function that you'd like to learn. And let's try to get our network to learn. Right? So now, let me actually say go 500 iterations this time. 5,000 iterations, and here. So this is another one of those cases where your neural network is doing perfectly on training data, right? Because it can learn arbitrary functions. Well, this one only has some small number of hidden representations, so it does not have sufficiently high, but it can still do exactly well. And now you're seeing this behavior that initially, both errors were going down, but at some point of time, your training error took a sharp dive low, and your validation error took a sharp dive to increase, right? So at this point, this is where you would realize, actually, if you were tracking your errors, you would probably stop here, right? You would do early stopping. When your training error is lower than validation error, then you would stop somewhere here. So the neural network can learn arbitrary types of functions. That makes sense?
It is the good part about this that we didn't have to specify the order of the polynomial we were trying.
Yeah, you did have to specify something, right? The thing that you had to specify was the architecture. So I said use 4 hidden neurons. If I try to use 2, for example, I don't think it does quite as well.
Well, what if we use too many?
We're already getting near to 100% training accuracy or 0 training error, right? So you can add more and it'll still be. The thing to remember is that I haven't talked about the loss function, and next time we'll talk about how to fit these parameters and what is the error function. But the error function is a highly non-linear, non-convex function in W's, those parameters that we're tweaking. And therefore, since it's non-convex, it has multiple local minimas. And therefore, initialization matters. You can get stuck in different local minimas based on where you start. And usually, there isn't as much principal theory to explain this. Usually, the more parameters you have, the deeper the network, the more the hidden layers, the harder usually it gets to train. And so you don't want to use a deeper or a bigger network than you'd like to. You'd like to build your thing. Yes?
Each iteration is a single pass through all the training data. That's what each iteration is a single pass through all the existing data.
So mathematically, we haven't told you how this is optimized. In this particular implementation, I think not, because let's see, number of training cycles is 5,000. Yeah, this might actually be each iteration is full pass through the entire thing. In most modern implementations, you do the same thing as stochastic gradient descent. So you don't actually wait for an entire pass through training data. You pick one training data, compute a gradient, take a step in that direction. But these are all things that we talk about next time. So let's stop.